Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest is Stephen Lubet, Williams Professor of Law at the Northwestern University Pritzker School of Law. We will discuss his book, Interrogating Ethnography, Why Evidence Matters, which is published by Oxford University Press. So welcome to the program, Stephen.
Good to be here.
All right. So this book, I've been following the release of the book and its reception by the ethnographic community, which I hope we can talk about later. But I really enjoyed reading it and found it kind of a really provocative way of thinking about what it is that ethnographers do and how they do it. But for listeners who might not be familiar with ethnography and sociology, I wonder if you could just briefly kind of explain to people what ethnography is and sort of how it relates to sociology as a broader field.
Ethnography sounds as though it's about ethnic groups, and that's the way it began. But it is, I think, currently the study of communities by participant observers. I think that's the simplest way to put it. There are many branches and many approaches to ethnography, and I have not really immersed myself in the inside baseball aspects of it because my interest has been in the sort of broader reliability of the various studies. But I think you could safely say it is the intensive study of a particular community by a participant observer, somebody who lives or at least spends lots and lots of time within the community. And it can be a physical community, a professional community, or a hobby community. There have been ethnographies of mycologists, mushroom hunters, Little League Baseball on one end of the spectrum, and ethnographies of criminals on the other end, and of hospitals somewhere in between.
Okay. So what kinds of evidence do ethnographers gather and use when they're conducting these studies?
Well, I think they fall into three categories, although the ethnographers don't really put it this way. One is the first-hand observation, the things that the participant observer actually sees and experiences. The second is information that is provided secondhand from the sources, or they call or informants, they call them, the people who are being studied. And the third sort would be familiar to lawyers, is sort of background documentation and other sorts of information. But the gold standard in ethnography is the participant observers, the researchers, actual experience and observation.
Yeah, so your book is kind of a critical reflection on how ethnographers gather and use evidence. What was it? Could you talk a little bit about what it was that kind of sparked your interest in this topic and in embarking on this project?
Sure, although I hope we won't dwell on it. Almost 4 years ago, almost exactly 4 years ago, a good friend of mine recommended a book that it was a bestseller, at least within the world of sociology, called On the Run by a young woman named Alice Goffman, who was at the time, I guess she still is, I'm sorry, a professor at the University of Wisconsin. And the book recorded or reported on 6 years that she had spent living in an African-American community in West Philadelphia among people whom she called on the run, sort of petty criminals whose exposure to the criminal justice system had resulted in a series of warrants that made them unable to participate in sort of regular above-ground activities, from employment, couldn't get driver's licenses, couldn't really attend school. And she started this research when she had been an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania and continued it on into her graduate years at Princeton, and then ultimately wrote the book that was released in 2014. So a good friend of mine read this book, which had gotten glowing reviews, New York Review of Books, New York Times, The New Yorker, and places outside of New York. It had really gotten glowing reviews. So I read the book expecting really to like it. And there's a lot in it to like. It's very well written. It's extremely interesting. But page after page, I kept running across incidents that she reported, and I thought, no, that can't have happened the way she puts it. I have some experience in communities like that from long ago, and I thought, and more recently in criminal justice systems in Chicago, and I thought, this is just not accurate, can't be right.
So perhaps you could talk a little bit about your own research process in preparing to write this book.
Sure. So first, let me tell you what I did with On the Run, reporting these various incidents that she claimed occurred in Philadelphia. The one that's the most famous is the claim that the Philadelphia police set up checkpoints outside of emergency rooms in the hospitals that serve the African American community and demand the ID of people walking in order to run them for warrants. And then she added that they obtain patient and visitor lists from these hospitals and run those for warrants. So, that's a very specific claim, and at least in the explanation of it in On the Run, it's something that would be happening out in the open. So I read 3 other ethnographies of the same neighborhoods in Philadelphia, including one that took place in hospital emergency rooms, and nobody reported anything at all similar. So I then contacted every hospital that would roughly fit the definition that she was describing, and I spoke to security and public relations and other officials there. They all denied that anything like that went on. I interviewed 2 Philadelphia public defenders. They said that nothing like that had ever occurred. And finally, I interviewed the public safety director who had then been in office in Philadelphia, an African American who himself had been a public defender for 20 years before becoming the director of public safety, which is like the superintendent of police. And he said the same thing, that nothing like that ever happened. So that made me pretty much conclude that at a minimum, this idea of a police cordon around the emergency room was exaggerated. And I wondered if the same thing could be said about other ethnographies, and I set out to read them. I read about 50 ethnographies over the space of about maybe a year. And of course, in most cases, you can't verify what the people are saying because the locations are masked and the people involved all have pseudonyms and there are no dates. So it's extremely difficult to do any sort of kind of fact-checking that you would do about journalism. And I found whatever facts I could that seemed to be susceptible of fact-checking through sort of standard journalistic means. So many things that I could fact-check actually could be verified, and some things couldn't be. My main finding, though, was that ethnographies did a very poor job of distinguishing between what the ethnographer had actually observed and things they had been told, right? And I thought that is really the minimum requirement for reliability. When I'm reading a book, I would like to know whether this is something the author really saw, in which case I'm pretty much willing to take their word for it, or if it's in terms familiar to lawyers, whether it's hearsay and unverified, in which case I'm going to be more skeptical.
Right. So, among other things in your book, you mention Mitchell Denier's concept of an ethnographic trial. How did that inform your research project, if at all?
Denier is an extremely highly regarded and famous ethnographer. He's at Princeton. He got his PhD at the University of Chicago, and coincidentally, he did his undergraduate work at Northwestern. But he wrote two really highly regarded ethnographies. One is called Slim's Table, about a restaurant in Hyde Park, and the other one is called Sidewalk, and it's about magazine sellers on 6th Avenue in New York. He spent a year on the sidewalk selling magazines. And in an article that he wrote, he recognized that one problem with ethnography is that you only ever get one person's view, right? You only get one side of the story. You only get the ethnographer's reflections or observations. And he suggested that the ethnographers themselves should subject their own work to a sort of cross-examination, that before you publish, you ought to say, what would a cross-examiner ask about my own work? What have I been leaving out? What have I been reporting because it's convenient? And what facts have I omitted because they're inconvenient, as sort of a self-check? And I thought that was an excellent idea, and that I would therefore extend the ethnographic trial and ask the same sorts of questions about the material that I'd read.
So in evaluating the sort of epistemic practices of the ethnographic community, you used, I don't know if I call it a metaphor or heuristic of like the difference between malpractice and negligence. And that was helpful for me in kind of understanding what you were getting at. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, in Denier's article about the ethnographic trial, he said, you should imagine that you are being sued for ethnographic malpractice, or that you might be exposed to ethnographic malpractice, and then see how you would adjust your work to avoid that. I thought that was a mistaken standard, because malpractice is based on the practices within the community. And if every ethnographer was doing the same thing, then it wouldn't be malpractice, no matter how unreliable it might be. So I thought it would be better to substitute the concept of negligence, right, which is based on a reasonable person standard. What would a reasonable person want to see in the way of verification in ethnography?
Right. And so that kind of legal distinction that you're describing and that you drew on there seems like sort of something that you were bringing to the entire project. In other words, sort of using concepts drawn from litigation to think about kind of parallel practices in the ethnographic community. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how kind of litigation and your experience as a litigator and law professor kind of informed the way that you looked at practices within the ethnographic community, and why.
I suggested looking at legal standards really pretty much as a metaphor. And this has been, I think, either naively or intentionally misunderstood by a lot of people in the ethnographic community. I don't suggest for a minute that ethnographic monographs should be subjected to legal standards of evidence, but I do suggest that lawyers have spent a lot of time working out ways to evaluate the reliability of data or evidence, and that by analogy or metaphor, it could be useful to ethnographers. Not that they have to adhere to it the same way courts do, but that they ought to be open to the experiences of other professions. I also looked at journalism and history, They ought to be open to the experiences of other professions in evaluating the reliability of their own work. One example I alluded to earlier is the hearsay rule. Right? As lawyers know, the hearsay rule applies to statements that are being offered for the truth of the matter asserted, or to make it simpler, that are being offered for their truth value, as opposed to statements that are being offered to show the state of mind or a set of beliefs or fears or hopes of the informant. And I suggested that ethnographers ought to draw the same distinction. Not that they should stop relying on hearsay. Obviously, what they're there to do is to listen to their informants and report what they say. But they should use be more precise in the purpose for reporting what their informants say, and whether the statements can be relied upon for their truth, or rather they should be relied upon for something else about the informant. I'll give you an example. There's a really excellent book called $2 a Day by Eden and Schaefer. And it is an ethnography of the poorest of all Americans, people who live on $2 a day or less. And it's more people than you would expect. And the gist of the book is that even extremely poor people who are barely keeping body and soul together view themselves as potential workers. They're people who would like to be working, like to be employed, like to be working in the employment economy, but for many reasons, most of which are beyond their control, they find themselves really in the grip of extreme poverty. And that's what the book is about. And it's an extremely good book. I recommend it. But there are vignettes in the book, even so, that I find very questionable. And therefore, I did some research on them. One was a woman. So one of the points in the book, of course, is that women with children have a particularly difficult time extracting themselves from poverty, especially since cash welfare was pretty much ended in the Clinton administration. You used to have aid to families with dependent children, and that doesn't exist anymore. So they reported on one young woman who they said had made every possible effort to avoid becoming pregnant, but she was taking antibiotics that neutralized her birth control, and therefore she became pregnant and had a child, and this resulted in a cycle of poverty. And they reported that as though it was a fact that antibiotics neutralize birth control. Well, antibiotics don't neutralize birth control, which I learned by consulting Planned Parenthood and the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. It's a myth. It's a rumor. It's a widely spread rumor, but it's just not true. So does this make much difference to the story? Not really. But I thought that it would be more responsible for the authors to say that the woman had an explanation for how she had become accidentally pregnant, but the real story must be that she was not as dedicated to the use of birth control as she says she was. And I thought that would have been a much clearer explanation of the situation. Now, what makes this particularly interesting is that Catherine Eden, the author of this, the co-author of this book, has written two other books about one called Promises I Can Keep, which was about women who had children, unmarried women who had children. And the other one was called Doing the Best I Can, which was about the fathers, unmarried fathers who had children. And in both of those books, she had reported spotty or non-existent use of birth control as the reason that these kids had been conceived and born. Well, that's pretty understandable. But when we get to the book about poverty, suddenly it becomes the consequence of antibiotics rather than irregular use of birth control. And I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah. So in your book, you also talk quite a bit about the practice of anonymization in ethnography. So I wonder if you could talk about why ethnographers anonymize, why you think that can be a problem, and sort of how to mitigate that problem consistent with the goals of ethnographic research.
You have to compare it to journalism, where they don't anonymize except in extreme circumstances where there is a particular reason. In contrast, ethnographers anonymize everything. They anonymize names. They anonymize neighborhoods. They change dates. They change personal characteristics going well beyond anonymization, and they use composites, all of which are prohibited in journalism and seldom used in any kind of nonfiction writing, although that is a technique very common in memoir. Well, why do they do it? One reason is that institutional review boards that approve human subjects research sometimes, often, require anonymization, at least as the default. So ethnographers have taken this default requirement of the institutional review boards and adhered to it and expanded on it, which creates great difficulties if you ever want to try to validate or reproduce the study. If you ever want to try to reproduce the study. So, for example, if a later ethnographer wanted to go back to a community and see if things have changed, well, that's impossible because you don't know the communities where the initial study was conducted. The ethnographers, of course, say that they are ethically required to do this, but I don't think that's true. I think, especially in terms of changing the names of the locales, that's just a tradition that goes back to the early days of ethnography when William White conducted a path-breaking ethnography in the north end of Boston. Everybody knew it was the north end of Boston, but he called it Cornerville. The Linds did an ethnography in Muncie, Indiana, which they called Centerville. I think that's just a conceit, and that should be abandoned completely. As to using real names, I understand why that needs to be anonymized as required by the IRBs, but not always. I think ethnographers would be surprised at how many of their subjects would allow them to use real names. And since they have to get consents anyhow, I think they ought to at least begin by asking, may I use your name? And often enough, the ethnographers who have requested that, including Mitchell Denier, they have been given permission to use real names. And I think more of that ought to happen.
So in your book, you give some examples of ethnographers who you think have done an especially good job sort of on their own mitigating some of the problems that you identify. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what they did, why you think it was effective, and whether those are things that other ethnographers can and should do as well.
The paradigm is Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, which I praised greatly. I used it as the sort of model of the best way to do it. And he and I were both validated, he more, when he won the Pulitzer Prize. So I want to say I was praising that book before it won the Pulitzer Prize. He fact-checked the claims of his informants. I mean, as simple as that. Not only did he fact-check what people told him, but then he hired a professional fact-checker who went over the material and compared it to his notes. to make sure that claims were supported. Just to give you one example, he interviewed a young woman who said she had dropped out of high school because there was a shooting in the school. Well, those things are recorded, so he was able to check and see if there was a shooting at the school, determined that there was not, and therefore he left that story out of his book. Obviously, not everything can be fact-checked, but more can be fact-checked than many ethnographers take the time to do.
Mm, mm. So, I mean, are those the kinds of things that are available to all ethnographers? I mean, it sounds pretty burdensome and potentially expensive. I mean, to what extent is that something that sort of people can do across the board, or are there ways of approximating better practices, even if those can't necessarily be achieved?
I think anybody who's writing a book can check public records, and I think that just ought to be part of writing a book. Anybody who's writing a book can wonder about the accuracy of things they've been told, and in the age of Google, an awful lot of that can be fact-checked pretty readily. Desmond was asked a question about that in an interview with New York Magazine, and he suggested that graduate students ought to take turns fact-checking each other, that it can be done on a reciprocal basis for little or no expense.
So how has your book been received by the ethnographic community? Have people been receptive to some of the suggestions that you made, or has it been a more mixed reception?
Well, some people have been extremely receptive. I've gotten very good reviews and very good comments from very senior and prominent ethnographers. And then there have been howls of outrage. I think one thing I have learned about ethnographers is that they do not take well to criticism. And I'm just fine with people writing critical reviews. Doesn't bother me. I post them on my blog along with the favorable reviews so that people can see them, as you know. But I've been really pretty shocked by the defensiveness and wagon circling, which I have not seen in other disciplines.
I mean, are there particular aspects of your critique that ethnographers, or kind of some ethnographers, have found especially troubling or objected to most strongly? And if so, why do you think that is?
Well, I think ethnography itself is questioned within sociology. The turn in contemporary sociology has been toward quantification, quantifiable work. So the quants are sort of in the ascendance in sociology, and qualitative sociologists, ethnographers, are feeling themselves somewhat marginalized. So when I come along and say, you need to fact check your qualitative work more, you can understand why this has been characterized constantly as though I were attacking the field, which is not true. I like ethnography. I've read more ethnography in the last couple of years, I think, than most professionals. I think it's enriching. I think it's interesting. I think it gets at issues that the quants cannot address. I just think it needs to be stronger and more reproducible. But there's been a lot of resentment about that. I'll give you one example. I told you about the alleged hospital blockade in Professor Goffman's book, and my attempts to determine whether that was accurate were pretty extensive. I interviewed about 10 or 12 people who had direct knowledge, and I looked at other ethnographies. So I thought I did about as much work as somebody could do to try to verify it. But in a recently published review, and ethnographers said, what Lubet really needs to do is the shoe leather research and go to the hospitals and see whether the police are there and see if the nursing staff is cooperating with police. So I thought that was pretty defensive. First, of course, in Goffman's book, the hospitals are anonymized, so I don't know, and they're in Philadelphia, and I'm in Chicago. But the real issue, I thought, is, well, how come you're not doing that? You know, why hasn't another ethnographer in Philadelphia, of whom there are many, tried to verify this? You would see that in journalism. You would see that in the hard sciences. You would see that all the time in political science. You know, people attempt to replicate or verify the work of others. Now, here's an example of a very controversial observation in ethnography that could be very easily checked out by another ethnographer working in the same community. And to this day, nobody's done it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it would be a real scoop if it were a journalist.
Well, the one journalist who did look into it from Philadelphia Magazine found no evidence of the phenomenon, as I found no evidence of the phenomenon, as everybody who would be knowledgeable about it has said that it doesn't happen. Another law professor, Paul Campos, from the University of Colorado, also looked into this and found no evidence of it. But, if I'm wrong, if there really are police checkpoints, some ethnographer ought to prove me wrong, right? I mean, that's the way science, social science, is supposed to work. But it does not seem to happen much in ethnography.
Have there been critical responses from the ethnographic community that you thought were well taken, or that changed your mind about some of the positions you took in your book?
I would love to see somebody in the ethnographic community reinvestigate and show me wrong. That would be fine with me. It hasn't happened.
I'm thinking more kind of broadly in terms of the sort of philosophical or kind of methodological approaches that you talk about in the book. To what extent has the ethnographic community pushed back against any of the assessments or kind of prescriptions that you suggest? And to the extent they have, did you find any of that convincing?
Well, they've pushed back a lot. The typical response when I have reinvestigated something and questioned its validity has been to say, well, I can imagine that could be true, which I think is a rather invalid way of looking at the world. I think the burden of proof, to put it in lawyers' terms, is on the person who makes the affirmative assertion. And I can imagine it, I think, is an extremely weak way of evaluating evidence in social science. I think it would be fine if we were looking at oral history or memoir or fiction. The ability to imagine a state of affairs is a fine way of evaluating that sort of writing. But in social science, I would expect to see more, and I've been very disappointed, actually, that ethnographers have not seen the problem with imagining that something is true.
So it seems like your book has provoked or maybe illuminated a kind of schism within the ethnographic community. I wonder, in closing, if you could reflect on whether you anticipate or see the beginnings of sort of efforts toward reform of epistemic practices.
I think there is a movement in ethnography to greater validation and more fact-checking and clearer distinction between what has been seen and what has been heard. I hesitate to claim credit for it, but the timing suggests that I have caused people to rethink the way they're presenting their material. Here and there, someone says, "Well, I don't like what Lubet does. I don't think law tells us anything about ethnography, but we should fact check more." So I'm happy with that. It's fine with me to have stirred that discussion, and I hope it continues.
Excellent. Well, Steve, thanks so much for coming on the program. This is a really fascinating conversation. And I got to say, I really thought your book was fantastic.
Great. Thank you.
It's the real thing in the back of your mind. What you're hoping to find is the real thing. It's the real thing.